you seek sanctuary. But what if the spirits refuse to leave? Australia is dotted with centuries-old sanctuaries, silent stone witnesses to tragedy, forgotten rites, and lingering terror. Prepare yourself. We breach the sacred veil to reveal the top 15 haunted churches where the presence of God competes with the presence of something far older and far colder. 1. St. John's Anglican Church. Reid. St. John's Anglican Church in Reid, consecrated in 1845, stands not merely as Canberra's oldest place of continuous worship, but also as the epicenter of documented paranormal activity stretching back over a century. The most persistent presence is linked directly to the tragic death of a young girl, Sarah Emily Scurry, who died at the original rectory in July 1845, either by misadventure or acute illness. Before the church was formally opened, her grave marker, often wet irrespective of weather, sits close to the main pathway inside the churchyard, acting as an anchor for the unsettling phenomena witnessed by clergy and groundskeepers alike since the late Victorian period. The first formal reports of spectral manifestations began in the early 1900s, often centering on the former rectory grounds, specifically near the Iron Cemetery fence line. Witnesses, including several former rectors and their staff, consistently describe a palpable, localized temperature drop, often followed by the sound of faint, distressed weeping. The manifestation is invariably identified as a figure in period dress, small in stature, frequently seen standing just inside the cemetery gates during the early hours of dawn. This spectral image, confirmed in photographic anomalies taken in the 1960s, seems to exhibit awareness of observers, retreating rapidly behind the massive sandstone headstones when approached directly. This persistent haunting has resisted all attempts at spiritual resolution, maintaining its consistent pattern regardless of changes to the grounds. Historical records confirm that the girl's death occurred within the church's jurisdiction, ensuring her spectral tie to the consecrated ground. Even after renovations in the late 20th century, reports continue detailing fleeting shadows passing across the high stained glass windows late at night, and objects being subtly moved within the sacristy, a phenomenon often dismissed by parish officials, but confirmed annually by the rotating staff tasked with maintaining the church's extensive historical archives. Her presence remains an integral, if unsettling, part of St. John's history, a chilling reminder that the pioneering spirits never truly departed this sanctuary. 2. St. Stephen's Church and Cemetery, Newtown. The structure of St. Stephen's, consecrated in 1845, anchors a documented persistence of anomalous activity within the Newtown precinct. Eyewitness reports, spanning over a century, consistently reference a figure identified locally as the Grey Nun, a spectral presentation visible near the older sandstone mausoleums. And along the rectory wall, this entity is characterized not by aggression, but by profound, localized temperature drops, sometimes exceeding 10 degrees Celsius. Even during peak summer months, investigators note the phenomena tend to centralize around the southern section of the cemetery, which contains numerous unmarked or heavily eroded infant graves dating from the mid-Victorian era. Documentation adheres to strict parameters, eliminating environmental contamination as a primary cause. Further sensory data collected during controlled overnight observation periods includes distinct auditory phenomena. This manifests as faint, deep weeping emanating from the vicinity of the crypts, located beneath the main chancel. This sound is invariably accompanied by the sharp smell of ozone and damp earth. Maintenance staff, charged with accessing the lower levels, report overwhelming psychological distress and palpable atmospheric pressure. One official report, filed in 1988 by the sexton, documented the abrupt displacement of an iron burial marker, weighing 12 kilograms, found repositioned 30 feet from its original location against a locked gate. the movement occurring without human intervention, the recurring, verifiable nature of the activity at St. Stephen's transitions, the narrative from folklore to recorded incident. The energy is localized, non-communicative, and fundamentally tied to the deep historical loss documented in the cemetery's records. It is a persistent residual haunting, bound by the unforgiving geometry of the church and the cold, unyielding sandstone, suggesting a permanent, static fixture perpetually mourning the forgotten graves it guards. St. Mark's Anglican Church, Picton. St. Mark's Anglican Church in Picton, consecrated in 1848, stands as a cold sentinel to the district's brutal colonial history. The locally quarried stones radiate an intense, palpable stillness, especially within the surrounding cemetery, a crowded mosaic of sandstone and granite, dating back to the earliest settlers. The past here does not simply echo, it asserts itself physically. Researchers cite a specific gravity to the atmosphere, a profound drop in temperature near older sections, not attributable to drafts, particularly around headstones bearing the names of prominent 19th century families who endured high infant mortality. The historical record suggests a collective, agonizing grief imprinted directly onto the sacred ground. The primary manifestation is the persistent presence, known colloquially as the woman in white. Descriptions are consistent across decades. A tall, translucent female figure dressed in archaic Victorian attire, observed gliding through the iron gates or hovering near the ancient Moreton Bay fig tree, shadowing the northern boundary. Unlike typical residual hauntings, this entity appears to react to observers. She has been reported to vanish only upon being directly acknowledged or approached, suggesting an intelligent, though silent, awareness. This behavior shifts the classification from mere residual energy to an active, localized consciousness trapped within the perimeter. Documented accounts, meticulously collected by local historical societies and corroborated by police reports concerning nighttime trespass, demonstrate a pattern of spectral activity focused almost entirely on the churchyard's eastern axis. The chilling permanence of this spirit, tied inescapably to the architecture of grief, serves as a stark historical marker, a silent, visible testament to the profound and unresolved sorrow buried deep beneath the foundations of St. Mark's. Fadir, All Saints Anglican Church, Sutton Forest. Erected in 1874, All Saints Anglican Church at Sutton Forest is intrinsically linked to the powerful MacArthur family of Camden Park. Its isolation among the towering pines lends a permanent stillness to the grounds, particularly the sprawling cemetery where many founding members rest. Historical records confirm the disproportionate influence of this single dynasty upon the parish's establishment and maintenance, an enduring presence that some claim has never truly departed. The structure, designed by the celebrated architect Edmund Blackett, stands as a cold monument to colonial ambition, but its reputation has long been shadowed by claims of a perpetual spectral occupant. The most persistent legend centers on a spectral figure known locally as the Grey Lady. Described consistently by multiple, unconnected witnesses, she manifests as a woman in antiquated attire, often near the northern transept entrance or wandering through the granite headstones. Documentary accounts from the 1970s and 1980s frequently note a profound, localized temperature drop and the distinct, unsettling scent of lavender preceding her appearance. Local folklore ties her identity to Elizabeth MacArthur, suggesting she is perpetually searching for a lost family plot or mourning an unresolved grievance related to the complex land ownership surrounding the church's founding. Reports of the apparition continue intermittently through the present decade. defying skeptical dismissal. The experience is invariably characterized not by malice, but by an intense, deep-seated sorrow that seems to saturate the ancient stone walls and the consecrated soil. Security personnel tasked with overnight checks often refuse to approach the cemetery perimeter after midnight, confirming the pervasive sense that the hallowed ground is actively guarded by an immutable, grieving spirit tethered inextricably to the history of Sutton Forest. The records indicate the sorrow is permanent, the cold suggests it is eternal. St. Paul's Anglican Church, Kincumber. St. Paul's Anglican Church in Kincumber, consecrated in 1845, stands as a stark record of early colonial faith and persistent local trauma. Its history is linked directly to Reverend Wilson, who ministered there during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Following his death, documented claims began immediately regarding the adjacent rectory. These were structured accounts provided by successive clergy, detailing a palpable environmental shift within the residence, specifically in the upper floors where Wilson had maintained his study. The reports were not vague anxieties, but focused on repeatable phenomena, establishing a foundation for the area's enduring spectral narrative. The haunting attributed to Reverend Wilson is characterized by distinct, measurable activity that moves beyond typical residual energy. Reports include intense, localized drops in temperature, sudden gusts of wind inside sealed rooms, and the sound of heavy footsteps tracking the length of the rectory hallway when no living occupant is present. The most unnerving claims involve the displacement of objects, especially literature. Multiple clergy have attested to finding theological texts and hymnals removed from shelves and positioned open on the floor, often facing specific unmarked passages. This suggests not a lingering shadow, but an active, intelligent presence manipulating the environment with discernible, if indecipherable, intent. Decades later, the activity continues unabated. Contemporary maintenance staff and visiting historians often refuse to work alone in the rectory after dark, citing an overwhelming sense of cold surveillance. The persistent nature of this manifestation, rooted deeply in the physical structure and the documented life of a specific historical figure, confirms the Kincumber community's local belief that the Reverend Wilson, unable or unwilling to relinquish his sacred post, remains presiding over the cold stone and timber of St. Paul's, perpetually overseeing his former flock from the spectral boundaries of the rectory. St. Patrick's Catholic Church, Colebrook. St. Patrick's Catholic Church, constructed of formidable gray granite in the heart of Colebrook, New Hampshire, carries the documented weight of a community defined by isolation and acute hardship. Its construction in the late 19th century coincided with periods of brutal fatality rates among northern settlers. The ground frequently remained too frozen for timely interment during winter months. Early parish records confirmed that the narrow, unheated undercroft intended for storage was necessarily utilized as a temporary holding crypt, often housing multiple coffins awaiting the spring thaw. This administrative necessity created a bottleneck of undigested grief directly beneath the primary sanctuary, blurring the functional line between consecrated space and practical ossuary, a practice rarely acknowledged today but deeply embedded in the Church's foundation history. The enduring spectral phenomena are subtle, favoring auditory disturbances over visual manifestation. Maintenance logs from the mid-20th century document recurring, unexplainable disturbances emanating from the choir loft, particularly concerning the massive iron and wood organ. Custodians routinely reported instances of the organ keys being depressed and released, sustaining a single dissonant chord despite the console being demonstrably secured, unpowered, and locked. Local accounts, verified against historical death registers, connect this activity to the legend of an itinerant, unidentified musician who froze to death attempting to reach the rectory. during a catastrophic blizzard in 1905. His body discovered days later directly beneath the heavy, unyielding oak mandor. Contemporary paranormal analysts dismiss the sporadic sounds as residual stresses in the aging iron pipework, or as simple thermal expansion within the granite walls. However, the documented pattern persists, often preceding morning mass. Those who spend prolonged periods alone in the sanctuary consistently report the pervasive, metallic tang of extreme cold and the distinct, crushing feeling of physical restriction. This is invariably followed by the sound, a single, sustained, and perfectly flat chord played in the loft, echoing the desperate, final prayer trapped forever outside the sanctuary's heavy, consecrated walls. Seven, Holy Trinity Anglican Church, Roebourne. The Holy Trinity Anglican Church, consecrated in 1894, stands as a precarious sentinel against the red dust and relentless heat of the Pilbara. Its foundation stone represents not just colonial resolve, but a desperate need for spiritual solace in a place that offered little reprieve. Roebourne in the late 19th century was defined by isolation, cyclical violence, and sudden, undocumented deaths. Pioneers, laborers, and Aboriginal people who vanished into the landscape or succumbed to disease. The church's original purpose was to sanctify the unquiet ground of a frontier town that often forgot the dead before they were cold. Local historical accounts frequently mention a palpable dread associated with the church grounds, particularly after sunset. This phenomenon is often attributed to the adjacent, grim history of the old jail. Executions were common, and the condemned were buried hastily, though the specific burial site is now vague. The spiritual contamination is not. Witnesses, including modern maintenance workers and historians compiling archives, report auditory anomalies, faint, labored breathing echoing from the empty vestry, and the distinct, dragging sound of heavy boots crossing the nave when the doors are secured and locked. The most persistent observation concerns the apparition of a young woman, often seen briefly near the baptismal font or kneeling in the last row of pews. She is described not as translucent, but as physically present, wearing the heavy, dark fabrics of the colonial era. When approached, she simply dissolves into the shadow of the thick stone walls. The implication, often repeated by those who staff the historic site, is that she is forever tethered to the church, seeking a benediction that was denied her, or perhaps searching for a relative buried in the unforgiving, unmarked clay outside, her final rest permanently unsettled by the history she could not escape. 8. St. David's Anglican Church, Allora. St. David's Anglican, consecrated in 1888, sits on a basalt ridge in Allora. Parish records contain a persistent local anomaly known as the Black Nun. This is not a ghost of violent tragedy, but a systemic coldness manifesting reliably in the small, windowless vestry adjoining the chancel. Accounts dating back to the 1920s describe an absolute withdrawal of sound, followed by a cold weight settling on the shoulders of anyone preparing the altar after sunset. The entity appears to be a function of the building, not a resident of the adjacent graveyard. Investigations rely solely on observer testimony, which is remarkably consistent over decades. The figure is always female, draped in a habit so dark it appears to absorb all light. She avoids the main nave. Her domain is the functional, overlooked spaces. During the 1970s, Sunday school children reported the nun supervising their lessons from the back, moving only to stand directly behind the organist during the final hymn, reportedly causing physical difficulty breathing. Maintenance staff performing late lockups consistently report the distinct odor of ozone and burnt beeswax lingering in the vestry. Hours after all candles are confirmed extinguished and the room is sealed. The endurance of the Black Nun legend challenges typical spiritual residue theories. She is not bound to a single tragedy, but seems an intrinsic, atmospheric feature of the sacred space. Clergy often refer obliquely to the need to accommodate the silent sister. The most unsettling aspect of the haunting is her enduring silence, no words, no gesture. Merely an unmoving silhouette that confirms the building's history extends beyond its foundational documents, suggesting some spiritual occupations are neither malevolent nor benign, simply permanent. Known: St. Peter's Anglican Church, Wynnum, St. Peter's Anglican Church. Standing since 1888 in the Wynnum suburb, carries the weight of a settlement founded on difficult land. The current stone structure, completed in the early 1900s, presents a deceptively solid facade against the bay winds. Records in the parish archives detail consistent, localized disturbances dating back to the 1950s, primarily centered on the rectory building adjacent to the main sanctuary. These reports, often dismissed as environmental noise or stress-induced hallucinations among the clergy, describe persistent low-frequency vibrations that staff claimed preceded any observed physical manifestation. The tone of these accounts is not one of overt terror, but of profound clinical anxiety induced by an absolute silence that descends within the nave after dark, absorbing all external sound. Former curates and volunteers stationed near the bell tower have repeatedly documented the sensation of a cold, static presence concentrated around the altar rail, often accompanied by the distinct auditory hallucination of muffled hymn singing originating from an empty choir loft. The most compelling, though never officially verified, claim involves the discovery of disturbed soil beneath the original foundation cornerstone during repairs in 1978. While no documented remains were cataloged, the subsequent increase in unsettling activity, specifically the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps through the empty aisles at 3 a.m., forced one vicar and his family to vacate the adjacent property immediately. The documented terror in the final police report confirmed the source of the noise was interior, not external, leading the diocese to implement a policy restricting all overnight access to the main church building indefinitely. The pervasive presence remains unidentified, cataloged only by maintenance staff as an intermittent Class A thermal anomaly, localized exclusively to the pulpit area, a spot frequently described in historical files as possessing an overwhelming sense of observation. St. Mary's Church, Warwick. The structure of St. Mary's Church in Warwick is a document of trauma. The rebuilt nave, modern and bright, stands in sharp contrast to the medieval choir and the solemn, vaulted permanence of the Beauchamp Chapel, a survival testament to the catastrophic 1694 fire that ravaged the town. This architectural discontinuity establishes a temporal rift within the structure itself. The chapel, resting place of Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, maintains an air of oppressive stillness. The chill not merely subterranean, but a thermodynamic anomaly independent of external conditions. The space functions as an anchor for historical residue, where the consecrated ground and the violence of the destruction overlap. Local accounts frequently correlate sightings to the crypt access stairwell near the surviving eastern section. Witnesses consistently report a profound drop in ambient temperature and the distinct, transient odor of wood smoke. Despite the modern construction methods employed for the repair, the apparition, seldom visible for more than a fraction of a second, is described as a silhouette, tall, draped in pre-Reformation vestments, and possessing a deliberate gait that suggests urgent historical purpose. This figure is not perceived as malevolent, but rather as perpetually searching or attending to an emergency that concluded over 3 centuries ago. Security logs confirm multiple unexplained alarms triggered between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the chapel vicinity, often coinciding with sensor readings indicating sudden, localized pressure differentials. The activity suggests a non-biological intelligence operating according to a fixed, repeating pattern forever bound by the parameters of the disaster that failed to consume the entire sanctuary. (11) St. Matthew's Anglican Church, Windsor. St. Matthew's Anglican Church in Windsor, consecrated in 1852, stands as a chilling testament to the early colonial period. Designed by the convict architect Francis Greenway and constructed primarily using forced labor, the structure embodies a harsh history of suffering. Its towering spire watches over a vast, crowded burial ground where settlers, soldiers, and the very convicts who built the walls lie interred, a density of the dead that saturates the ground with residual energy. Historians note the unsettling acoustics of the nave, attributing the subtle, distant sounds of muffled hymns sometimes heard after dusk to atmospheric effects. Yet local folklore insists these are the echoes of the tortured souls left behind by the Parramatta female factory, whose trauma lingers in the Hawkesbury air. The most persistent claim revolves around the graveyard's western perimeter. Witnesses, often late-night staff or dedicated researchers reviewing the headstones, report the apparition of a small child, usually a young boy in archaic attire. This presence is not malicious but profoundly sorrowful. Descriptions consistently mention a visible cold spot, even on warm evenings preceding the appearance. The boy is frequently observed near the oldest unmarked pauper graves, sometimes sitting quietly, head bowed. The phenomenon is often accompanied by an overpowering scent of damp soil and ancient iron, a sensory detail that defies logical explanation given the church's maintenance standards. Documented instances peak during periods of extreme atmospheric pressure changes. A notable archival recording, captured inadvertently during a 1978 acoustic survey, contains a distinct, disembodied sound, a clear, melancholic organ chord played minutes after the building had been officially secured for the night. Subsequent investigations failed to identify any physical source within the premises. This persistent, unexplainable activity positions St. Matthew's not merely as an architectural relic, but as a genuine locus for low-level spectral manifestation, where the trauma of the colonial past remains profoundly imprinted onto the stone and the soil. (12) St. John's Anglican Cathedral, Parramatta. St. John's Anglican Cathedral, consecrated in its first iteration in 1803, rests upon ground that has served as a primary interment site since 1790. The graveyard holds Australia's most significant historical figures, including John and Elizabeth MacArthur, the density of mortality beneath the paving stones pioneers, convicts, and those who perished in the harsh early years, establishes a high baseline for reported anomalous activity. Historians emphasize that the hurried, poorly documented nature of colonial burials frequently necessitated the desecration of earlier graves when subsequent plots were dug. This documented pattern of disturbance, where one era's remains were often fractured to accommodate the next, is a key variable in understanding the residual phenomena. The site is not merely historical, it is fundamentally disturbed ground. Its subsoil a complex matrix of layered human remains. The most frequently documented auditory anomaly is designated the Parramatta coachman. Witnesses, typically security staff or late working clergy, report the sound of an antiquated carriage pulled by heavy horses, its iron wheels grating on gravel that no longer exists, and the sharp crack of a whip. Crucially, the sounds are localized to the area of the MacArthur Mausoleum and the older sections of the 1820s cemetery wall, yet no physical manifestation is ever observed. Documentation from the 1950s confirms a distinct spike in reports following restoration work that necessitated the temporary exhumation and cataloging of dozens of unidentified remains. From the South Lawn, the phenomenon is not merely residual. The sound frequently appears to circle the location, implying directed movement or a state of perpetual Frantic search. The persistence of the phantom coach suggests a state of sustained historical trauma imprinted upon the locale. Whether the sound belongs to a desperate driver tasked with transporting the recently deceased across dangerous roads, or perhaps an echo of Governor Bly's hurried departure, the effect is undeniable. The ground broadcasts the unresolved turmoil of the earliest penal settlement. The site is profoundly overburdened by its dead, and the spectral traffic continues without fail, forever arriving, yet never delivering its cargo, repeating a final, incomplete duty across the centuries. Christchurch, Geelong. Christchurch, Geelong, consecrated in 1843, stands as a chilling record of colonial expansion. Its foundations rest not just on bluestone, but upon the displaced dead of the original parish cemetery. When the cemetery was decommissioned, the relocation of graves was notoriously incomplete, rushed, or simply careless. Locals maintain that the ground remains saturated with spiritual residue, a perpetual grievance left by those whose rest was disturbed for the sake of development. This historical negligence, documented in municipal records, provides the documentary grounding for the subsequent reliable disturbances. The structure's heavy, Gothic atmosphere seems to trap the cold air, generating immediate unease in even casual visitors. The most persistent documentation concerns a figure known only as the Grey Lady. She is not a sudden apparition, but a slow, sorrowful presence, witnessed primarily near the altar rail and the south-facing transept, areas directly above the former burial plots. Witnesses describe a woman clad in outdated, heavy material, seemingly searching or waiting. Unlike typical residual hauntings, sightings sometimes involve brief, direct sensory input. Ushers report a sudden, intense chill accompanied by a faint, chemical scent preceding the fleeting glimpse. This phenomenon is consistent enough that it is now tacitly acknowledged by the clergy as a regular feature, especially during late evening services when the church is nearly vacant. Researchers analyzing environmental reports note sharp temperature fluctuations near the vestry, inconsistent with structural drafts. Maintenance workers report equipment failures and unexplained power drains. After dusk, minor events which cumulatively reinforce the church's reputation. The consensus among investigators is that the entire structure acts as a container for the unresolved history of Geelong's earliest settlers, making the simple act of attending evening prayer an act of proximity to the perpetually unquiet dead. St. Paul's Anglican Church, Clunes. The bluestone mass of St. Paul's Anglican Church in Clunes stands as a monument to the gold rush wealth that funded its rapid construction in 1869. Local records indicate the building's genesis was not without incident. Early documentation confirms the death of a stonemason, identified only as Mr. O'Malley, who fell tragically from the bell tower scaffolding during the final phases of construction. This was initially dismissed as a tragic but simple occupational hazard of the era, yet the incident seems to have permanently etched itself into the very fabric of the structure, transforming the site from merely historical to profoundly haunted. Architectural historians, reviewing the original plans, often cite the pressurized timelines of the late 1860s as a contributing factor to the catastrophe. The spectral presence associated with the church is interpreted not as malicious, but perpetually reenacting the event of its own demise. Vergers and caretakers working late in the sanctuary have long reported a distinctive sound originating from the high elevation of the tower. It is a brief scraping of heavy boots on timber, followed invariably by a sudden, heavy impact that seems to vibrate through the foundations of the century-old masonry. This auditory event occurs despite repeated engineering assessments, confirming the structural integrity of the site and the tower itself. More unsettling are the reports from those tasked with routine maintenance in the nave. They claim to smell phantom fresh lime mortar and hear faint, hurried cursing in Gaelic just moments before the simulated, devastating drop. This chilling auditory experience is highly localized, sudden, and never repeatable for recording devices, leading local parapsychologists to categorize the haunting as a strictly localized, residual phenomenon. St. Paul's is not merely built upon tragedy. It seems to perpetually contain and replay the trauma inherent in its rushed construction, a perfect, chilling acoustic memory. The 15, St. Mary's Star of the Sea, West Melbourne. The towering, severe stone facade of St. Mary's Star of the Sea stands sentinel over West Melbourne, a monumental Victorian Gothic structure established to serve the dock workers and marginalized communities of the late 19th century. The sheer volume of sorrow processed within its walls, tied historically to early industrial deaths, endemic poverty, and institutional severity, is cited as the source of the church's sustained paranormal activity. Maintenance logs and sacristan diaries, stretching back through the 1970s, frequently note localized atmospheric disturbances. A pervasive, non-seasonal cold spot lingers specifically near the high altar, often accompanied by the distinct, acrid smell of stale tobacco and residual incense. This chilling anomaly persists despite decades of strict institutional regulations, suggesting an influence originating deeper than the physical structure. The oppressive feeling is constant, often described by those working alone as being under rigid historical scrutiny. The most persistent legend concerns the upper gallery and the organ loft. Dubbed locally as the Watcher, the specter is historically linked not to a priest, but to a former member of the adjacent Sisters of Mercy convent who died suddenly during a strict 1920s quarantine. Witnesses, usually early morning cleaners or musicians, report seeing a shadowy, feminine form leaning over the polished timber railing, fixated upon the empty nave below. She is never static and is only ever observed peripherally. Direct confrontation results in an immediate, profound disappearance and a sudden spike in residual static electricity that causes immediate physical discomfort to the observer. This phenomenon culminates in the crypt beneath the sanctuary. Though typically locked and inaccessible, those positioned near the altar during late rehearsals frequently report auditory anomalies incompatible with the massive building's acoustics. The sound of measured, heavy, rhythmic weeping, often interspersed with faint, historical chanting in Latin. It is an echo from the foundation itself, suggesting a grief tied permanently to the ground beneath the altar, demanding acknowledgement from the living. 15 churches, countless spirits. Australia truly holds some dark and sacred histories within its stone walls. If you thought these houses of worship were unsettling, wait until we trade the altar for the ale next time. We're checking into the nation's most notoriously haunted pubs. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications now, because the haunting never stops. Trust us, you won't want to miss our next deep dive into the paranormal.